It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. On September 11th, 2001, that's 25 years ago in just a few months, a naval officer named Kevin Schaefer was working at his desk inside the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 tore through the building. Though his injuries were severe, he survived and went on to dedicate the next decade of his life to hunting Osama bin Laden. A soldier named Mark Little survived not one but two IED explosions in Iraq, led his men through the second one while still in shock, and later founded a nonprofit to help other wounded veterans. And a pilot named Danielle, nicknamed Purple Therio, climbed into a cockpit for the first time and knew that this was what she was doing, her life's work. These are some of the heroes next door, the American soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines who went to war, whom Martha Raddatz, ABC News chief global affairs correspondent and co-host of ABC This Week on Sunday mornings, profiles in her new book. I think it's fair to say most Americans, civilians who don't serve in the military, and increasingly don't know anyone who does, have only an abstract sense of who these people are. Martha Raddatz, while also covering global and Washington affairs at the highest geopolitical levels, also wants to make sure some of their stories are known to the broader public. Again, Martha Raddatz is ABC News chief global affairs correspondent and co-anchor of This Week. She covered every major military conflict of the post-9/11 era from the front lines. And some of you know she began all of it right here in public radio as NPR's Pentagon correspondent from 1993 to 1998. Her new book, The Hero Next Door, Stories of Patriotism and Purpose, is a dozen portraits of servicemen and women drawn from many years of reporting. Martha Raddatz joins me now. Martha, welcome, or in a way, welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to talk to you this morning.
And listeners, we can take some phone calls on this topic, maybe especially from veterans or active duty service members, military families. What do you wish civilians understood about your service or that of your loved ones that they don't? 212-433-WNYC, or with any question from Martha Raddatz, 212-433-9692. And Martha, I'll note that you wrote in the introduction, I have no military background of my own, no ancestral ties to the military, and I didn't grow up in a family or culture that was tethered to war or the military life. So what drew you to this world? Why this book now?
I think this book now, for precisely what you said, Brian, I think people feel disconnected from our military. We certainly went through a period post 9/11 where people were, sorry about that, thanking people for their service. But now they've almost forgotten that. And I think it's so important. And I've been around these people for decades. And I was there with the most critical days of their lives, and sometimes the days that changed them forever. And I've just sort of never discarded people I am close to or have shared something like that. And I want other people to know these are not superhuman people on the outside that you can't possibly get close to. A lot of these people left their homes in Texas or wherever, and 4 days later, after they're dropping off their kids at school in their minivans, were in a Humvee and in a battle. And I think what inspires me most about this is these are people who, some of them are still in the military, some of them have gotten out, but the ones who've gotten out have found a new purpose. And I think it can inspire us all. It really inspires me. I feel very strongly about this book and the stories in there, and I promise I am not trying to sell books. I want people to read this, to know who our citizens are, who volunteer for duty, who are right now in the Gulf, in the Middle East, 50,000 of them, that these are people who are doing work for us. They joined, many of them, because of 9/11, because our country was under attack and wanted to make it safer for people. So it's one of those things that, look, we all have opinions about the war. We all have political opinions. But this institution, this U.S. military, is something that should be neither political or the ones who decided we should go to war. These are not the people who did that. These are the people who were given that job, volunteered for that job, and did it to the best of their ability. But more than anything, all the people in this book are really good people, and they want to make life better for people. One veteran said to me, "I wish people wouldn't ask us how many people we've killed. I wish they would ask us how many lives we've tried to save."
So here's a text that just came in that I think you were really just addressing, but I'm curious if you get questions like this a lot. The listener writes, how to reconcile this with the fact that precisely none of our military actions since 9/11 have been remotely heroic. So do you have to detach these individuals from the policies? And do you get asked that a lot?
Nothing has been remotely heroic. I mean, people were bombing ISIS, okay? I mean, that there are pilots in this book who were wiping out ISIS, and ISIS was torturing and killing and raping women. I disagree. Now, did those wars end well? Did the Afghan withdrawal end well? Absolutely not. It was horrendous. It was chaotic. People died. It was really bad. But that was not the fault of these people. It was not the fault of our service members. They volunteered to do this job. So I completely disagree. There are heroic things they tried to do. I was with them during many, many embeds overseas and saw them up close. Believe me, if you want to look back on my reporting, if the military did something wrong and there were rogue people within it, I would report that. But that is not what I'm talking about here. These are people who volunteered for service and tried to make things better for people,
so let's talk
including our country.
Let's talk about some of these individuals. I want to give you the opportunity to do that. And you do open with Kevin Schaefer, a naval officer severely wounded in the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon, and Steve Workman, who came to his aid that day. You write, it's hard to imagine anyone with a stronger connection to the 9/11 generation than Kevin Schaefer. Tell us about those two and what their story sets up maybe for the rest of the book.
I think those are two of the original heroes of 9/11. Kevin Schaefer was a young Navy lieutenant in the Navy Command Center, and when that plane hit, the Navy Command Center erupted in fire. Kevin is the only one who survived in his area there and barely made it out alive. He crawled toward a light. There was a hole busted through the back of the Navy Command Center. He crawled out. He was burned badly, over 50% of his body. His uniform had melted onto him. And when he came out and sat down, Steve Workman, who was one level away and was not hurt, but instead of running away, Steve Workman, an Army sergeant, came towards the fire, came towards the smoke to see if there were survivors. And he found Kevin Schaefer sitting there alone. He treated him as quickly as he could, but he didn't really have anything with him. Kevin Schaefer looked up at Steve Workman and said, "Please don't let me die." And Steve Workman said, "I got you, man." And to this day, those men are bonded by that moment. Steve Workman ended up getting Kevin Schaefer to Walter Reed, commandeering an ambulance, driving through the city that was on absolute gridlock at that time, stayed with him, and was there every single day making sure Kevin was okay. And he knew that eventually Kevin had gone to work at the CIA, but he didn't know exactly what he was doing. I first met Kevin and Steve at the 20th memorial of 9/11. And I saw two men, one with his hand on the shoulder of the other, and I took a picture of them. And after the service was over, said I would like to share that picture. I didn't want to bother them. This was clearly a very moving day for them. Shared that picture. They just briefly told me that, oh, he saved my life. And then about a year and a half ago, I got a call from the CIA saying that Kevin wanted to tell me his story about since that day. And it turned out that Kevin had been on the high-value target team that found bin Laden. So this extraordinary circle where he was almost killed by bin Laden, and many of his friends were, to ending up helping hunt down bin Laden and watching in real time from the CIA the night Navy SEALs killed bin Laden. One of the first calls he made was to Steve Workman and said, "We got him, man." So they're just remarkable stories that very few people know about. None of these people in this book considers themselves a hero. I actually use that term with care, but they are heroes. I made sure that they knew that their stories were important to others, that they represented others, that I knew that it was teamwork. I knew they would give the credit to someone else. But I just think they are remarkable stories of courage and resilience. I mean, Kevin survived that day and was determined to work for his country still, to serve his country in some way. And boy, did he ever. And so did Steve Workman.
If you're just joining us, maybe you're recognizing the voice. Martha Raddatz, ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent and co-anchor of This Week on ABC on Sunday mornings. Her new book is The Hero Next Door, Stories of Patriotism and Purpose. It's a dozen portraits of servicemen and women, especially from the post-9/11 era, which we are now heading to the 25th anniversary of this September. It's all drawn from many years of reporting on the ground around the front lines, as she has been deployed to do so many times. There's a chapter I see on trailblazing service women. Rosemary Mariner was one of the first women to fly military jets. Danielle Theriot came up in a different era. What did it mean to put their stories in the same chapter? I'm curious. And what does the distance between their careers tell us about how the military has changed for women?
Their lives came together for me, Danielle and Rosemary, in 2019. And Rosemary Mariner, at age 65, died of ovarian cancer. She spent her entire career in the Navy as a pilot. But she was not allowed to fly combat missions at that time. And she fought very hard in Congress any way she could to allow women aviators into combat. She did not want special treatment for women. She wanted equal treatment. And for Rosemary, that was taking equal risk, that you couldn't be seen as someone equal by your male peers if you were not taking equal risk. So she fought hard for that. That cleared in the late 90s. And on that day, in that small cemetery near her farm, she shared with her husband and daughter, there was a flyover, the very first all-female Navy flyover. And the so-called missing man in that formation that day was Danielle Theriot. After the cemetery, after the funeral, we all met at the farmhouse, and all these incredibly accomplished young female fighter pilots who had all seen combat. We all gathered, and I met Danielle, and she told me the story of really pushing to get this first all-female Navy flyover for Rosemary's funeral, because Rosemary had been such an inspiration to her. All those women knew that they were seen as equals because of Rosemary Mariner. She was never able herself to fly combat missions. It was too late for her, but bringing those generations together and seeing that all-female flyover and knowing that those women are respected, no one thinks of them, oh, those are the women. They don't think of themselves that way of like, I'm different. They just do the best job they can as fighter pilots. And again, all had been in combat. And the more I got to know Danielle, I just thought she was the perfect legend of Rosemary Mariner. And that meant a lot to me personally. I knew Rosemary very well. She was one of the first people I met in the military when I was at NPR and I first started covering the Pentagon. I met Rosemary and stayed very close to her over the years. So that was a very moving, somber, yet happy day for all of us.
I know that you believe that some of the most powerful war reporting is about the people waiting at home. So maybe you want to discuss a little bit what made you want to give a chapter to the mothers, as you've included, and what did reporting those stories do to you?
Those are women I have known for more than 20 years. And I do think that's what's different about this book. These are people I know, these people I've seen for 20 years. I first met Debbie Schultz and her son Stephen about a year or so after he was injured back in 2005. And Stephen had a traumatic brain injury, and they did not think he would live. Debbie, who was 49 years old at the time, was going to make sure he did, and was going to make sure he was cared for. The same with Gail Ullery. Her son, Siobhan Phillip, was also injured around the same time. These mothers didn't know one another. Their sons didn't know one another, but their stories are so similar, they eventually ended up meeting. And Debbie is more than 70 years old today, and she is still taking care of Stephen. And Gail Ullery, whose son Siobhan died several years ago, the same. They dedicated their entire lives to those sons. All the while, Debbie has other children, Stephen's brother and sister, who helped as well, but had a normal life for those kids, but is still devoted to Stephen. Stephen has made remarkable progress. He's blind in one eye, has a very difficult time using one leg, but he can walk with a cane. His speech is a flat affect, I would say. He is not, as Debbie would be quick to tell you, the original Stephen, but she loves that young man, not so young anymore, beyond words. So I was always touched by Debbie and Gail, watching them over the years. I'm on the board of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. My colleague, who was injured in Iraq in 2007 by an IED, and he and his wife Lee started this incredible fund to help veterans. I met them through the Woodruff Foundation, so I see them every year at a Stand Up for Heroes event, and just seeing them every year and their courage and their purpose in being mother to their sons was just a really powerful thing to me. I mean, that is also one of the reasons I just always cover the home front. I mean, I don't think people realize that the challenge they face.
Part of the premise of you writing this book, as you've described, is that since most Americans today aren't connected to the military the way some past generations were, there hasn't been a draft since 1973, and by some estimates, fewer than 1% of Americans now serve. And therefore, you wanted to tell some of these stories of individuals, the kinds of individuals who people may have known personally in the past, more commonly, but don't today. And I think Marianne in Southampton, New York, has a question related to that. Marianne, you're on WNYC with Martha Raddatz.
Oh, good morning, Martha Raddatz.
Good morning.
Pleasure to speak with you. I have a question.
You.
With all that you've learned and seen, heard, and your compassion, do you think we should have a draft?
Boy, that's a decision that policymakers should make. I think that didn't work out so well, probably many years before. I just think people, I would love to see everyone serve in some ways, but that's also really complicated. A national service, I've heard, like Stan McChrystal thinks that would be a great idea. We are not in a situation where we have to draft people, but to your point, I think it's one of the reasons people don't pay attention to wars as much as they should, or understand why we're at war, why we go to war, or who's in charge, and all of that. Certainly, if your own child is drafted, you'd pay more attention. But I think what you should do instead is pay attention to the people who have volunteered. And I think for now that is what's working. That is what we have. And I just think as a society we need to appreciate that more, or at the very least know people who are fighting for us.
Marion, thank you very much. I want to acknowledge that we're getting a number of texts from people skeptical, like the earlier texter that I read, of celebrating members of the military in the way that you do in the book. I'll read one more. Listener writes, it could be difficult for people to celebrate people precisely because they volunteered, and they put volunteered, highlighted that word, volunteered to join the U.S. military, even when knowing the horrible things we were doing across the world, including illegal torture and detainment of enemy combatants. Similarly, how do we reconcile the disproportionately high incidence of sexual harassment and assault in the U.S. military with the notion of celebrating its members? So give people thinking thoughts along those lines one more response.
Okay, I'm happy to address that again. These are people who signed up after 9/11, after our country was attacked. A young soldier does not go into Afghanistan or wherever they were sent knowing the policies, knowing that there was torture going on, really probably knowing none of that. These people served their country honorably, who I write about, and what they have done since is extraordinary. They have lost their legs. They have been paralyzed for our country, to try to keep our country safe. Again, this is not a political book. This is not about war. This is not about supporting or not supporting a war. These are people who signed up and continued to serve because our country was attacked. And these people are an example of those who persevere, those who serve the country. And that's really all I can say about that. And if you read this book, and I presume the people who are saying this have not, I think you will find that these people in this book and what they did should be celebrated.
Martha, before you go, I want to ask you to put on your Chief Global Affairs for ABC News correspondent hat for a couple of questions. One, Iran says it won't conclude a deal with the United States until Israel withdraws from land it has recently taken in Lebanon. Israel says no to that as they insist on going that hard after Hezbollah, which for its part vows to keep attacking Israel long term. Can you see, based on your reporting, what a way out of the war might be for Trump with those conflicting interests that even don't have directly to do with the U.S. and Iran?
Look, we're now about 100 days into a war the administration said would last 4 to 6 weeks. I think they are looking for a way out. It has not worked so far. I don't see anything on the horizon that looks right now today that looks like this war is coming to an end. We have Israel going after Hezbollah again in Lebanon, even though they were going to do a ceasefire. So I think it's very difficult to see the way out right now or what the president would accept. And it's often very confusing, saying it looks like we have a deal and we're very close to a deal, and then we have no deal. I was in Pakistan when J.D. Vance was over there for those negotiations that they said looked promising. That was well over a month ago. So I do not know how this is going to end. Clearly, the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, the president has said, I don't care about the negotiations. Surely he cares because gas prices, everything else. And we have 50,000 U.S. forces over there. And by the way, one of my things is I wish we could see those 50,000 forces because I think for one of the first times, we have not seen anyone on those ships or at those bases have not been allowed to go on any sort of embed.
So that goes back to the theme of your book of humanizing the individuals who volunteer to serve, right?
Exactly. And I think that's important. And I think, like the viewers who are texting and saying they should not be celebrated, it's worth looking at who is over there. I don't think we can put them all in one basket and say they volunteered to do terrible things. You should see the humanity in the people who are doing this, and I think we should be allowed to see that as well, the press.
You mentioned being in Pakistan to cover some of those early talks. I'm curious how you assess the mediator countries, like Pakistan in particular, maybe Qatar also, how much pressure they may feel from various sides, and on their own economies that lead them into wanting to step up in that way?
I think, clearly Pakistan has been a leader in trying to mediate this and try to negotiate this in some ways. Qatar as well. I mean, look at how much this is affecting, especially those Middle East countries, those Gulf nations, and having the Strait of Hormuz closed. But you also have Iran, bombing Kuwait, for instance. So they definitely have a very, very big stake in this. It is complicated in the Middle East, whose relationship is with whom, but you have Iran there with these enormous threats and closing off the strait still. So that is where all focus is, and I think any of those countries who can negotiate and help with this, they're trying.
Martha Raddatz, ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent and co-anchor of ABC This Week on Sunday mornings, now the author of The Hero Next Door, Stories of Patriotism and Purpose. Martha, thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.